right, so now we're having Mariassunta Giannetti from Stockholm School of Economics to keep us dig deeper onto the theme of ESG and executive pay.
Okay. So I have a hoarse voice. So this is the 6th conference in 8 days, and I am not recovering as fast. But I am delighted to be here, and I'm presenting joint work with Gantchev and my student Marcus Hober. So why, of course, yes, compensation is a hot topic and a crowded topic by now. Why did we start to look at it? Because environmentally and socially conscious investors, some of them seem to prefer environmental and compensation to, for instance, long-term commitment. Why? Long-term commitment are in 50 years, yes, compensation is next year. So they think there are stronger incentives to act. But if I read the academic literature, including the paper that was presented before I was not aware about, the results are very mixed. Some find that when companies introduce ES compensation, performance improves. Some find something else. And it's not clear that these environmentally and socially conscious investors, some are activist hedge funds, are right on the spot. So how do we try to contribute to this debate? I am totally, we are unable to tease out causality from yes compensation to future performance. But we try to contribute to this crowded topic from a different angle. First, we ask whether these ESG metrics are really special. There are a lot of pay metrics that are being disclosed. Are ESG metrics substituting other metrics or not? Second, we try to be much more granular in the classification of the metrics using the Sustainability Accounting Board standards in the classification. And this helps a bit because the Sustainability Accounting Boards tell us for which industries the metrics are material. And the data that we purchased help us. Why? We have data from True Value, from FactSet, that allow us to link each SIBS metric to the performance on that particular metric. I, again, don't think I can look at causality on future performance, but I can look at how metrics are chosen. And this can inform me a bit on what companies are trying to achieve. And the other way in which we try to understand what are metrics for, is it greenwashing, is true concerns about environmental and social issues, is trying to tease out what are the intended consequences of the metrics. Of course, in economics, this is almost impossible, but what we try to look at is, remember, we have a good measure of performance on the ESG front, so we relate the compensation, the changes in compensation, to performance on overall ESG and the particular metrics that the companies contracts upon. So this is the broad motivation of what we try to do. Let me tell you something about the data. So we get the data from ISS, and that provide textual information about explaining the pay metrics that about 10,000 companies around the world use. Europe uses a bit more ES metrics than the US, but overall, these huge companies look very similar worldwide. So I will not show you splits. So, and second, my measure of performance along each of these metrics is not based on ESG ratings, precisely for some of the concerns that were raised before, but is based on basically AI analysis of a bunch of media articles around the world. You might be a bit more, you might know rep risk. Rep risk is only about incident. We have a score of the sentiment of this news for each of the SIBS metrics. And this is something we purchase from FactSet. We don't act on it. So a caveat, so you don't set your expectation too high, we just have a dummy about each of these metrics. We didn't collect any information about quantitative or soft targets, a bit for the reasons that Daniel had raised before. I am skeptical, and some of the previous literature had also found a mixed result. And a bit I am also not super confident that our data are good enough. But this is the background of what I'm going to do. And so let me show you some preliminary evidence. Are ESG metrics special? Not at all. Companies that have more ESG metrics tend to have many more operating metrics, earning metrics, and perhaps obviously market metrics. These companies tend to have more complex contracts probably, because these are companies with relatively more equity compensation. So these are not badly governed companies based on what we know on executive compensation. So what is the next step? I am trying to tease out with different specification what is the intended consequence of the metrics. How? Well, is how the presence of a metrics affect the correlation of pay to that measure of performance. So what do you see here? Companies that have ESG or other metrics, so the first four rows, I know from sitting there that is impossible to see, have a higher compensation. But that's an intercept effect, is an average effect. All CEOs are compensated more when their overall media coverage about ESG has been better. But if we look at what we call here metric news, that is the performance of the company, according to the news narratives, on the particular metrics that are contracted upon, what do we see? There is an effect on the total compensation that is 100 times lower, no, that is 10 times lower, sorry, than the effect of the total ESG coverage. So it's tiny. Company CEOs are just compensated for doing well. The particular metrics that is contracted upon doesn't matter, and no effect on variable compensation. So this suggests that perhaps the main incentive is, the main objective is not to incentivize good ES performance. Another way to look at it is to look at which companies use ESG metrics. As we would expect, and others have shown, these are companies that tend to have a more institutional ownership, and they do so to a larger extent if an active institutional investors arrive, so more shareholder interference. But do they choose the metrics that a ES-conscious investor would have wanted? Again, hard question to ask, but what I would think is that perhaps the institutional investors that are ES conscious would pick a metric along which the company has been lagging behind. Bad news. What you observe here is that these companies tend to pick metrics in which over the previous year they had relatively better media coverage. And if there are specific metrics on which they had negative media coverage, this is the coefficient, these are less likely to be selected. We confirm the result of previous literature that overall companies that introduce metrics, ESG metrics, when they had bad ESG performance, the overall media coverage there. But the metrics they select are metrics in which they are doing already well. They continue to do even better, but probably the CEO had some inside information. So why are these metrics chosen? And this is a bit related to what Anna was suggesting before. Well, we find that industry peer and ISS peers in particular matter. So, and these matter not only for ESG metrics, for all metrics, even though you will see in the paper we have a nice graph, the effect of ISS peer is a bit larger for ESG metrics, probably because, you know, they are easier to reach. So can we use these to try to understand why are these metrics used? And we relate to the broader literature on shareholder consensus. So what has changed together with greater attention to ES issue is that one, there is more disclosure about pay. There are say-on-pay votes. And the ISS and the other proxy advising agency are, well, advising investors on how to vote. So basically, what we test is whether companies with more metrics, and here is not specific to ESG metrics, is the ESG metrics plus the operating metrics plus the earnings at the market, have more support on the say-on-pay vote. This is precisely what we find. We try to use the ISS peers to devise an instrumentation strategy, but overall for me, the more convincing evidence that these are not companies that obtain better support because they are better governed companies come from this less econometric evidence. That is, companies introduce ESG metrics after they experience a descent on their say-on-pay votes. Okay, so that is, these are companies that had been doing a bit worse. So let me show you a bit more evidence. So is this only about say-on-pay or more general about shareholder interference? We start to look at ESG proposals. What you see here, or you don't see? You see that companies that have more ESG metrics are less likely to receive an ES proposals. But this is also true for companies that have more operating metrics, more earnings metrics, and other metrics. So what we suggest is that firms, by disclosing the metric and explaining to shareholders how they are compensating managers, are also communicating more broadly about what target in the strategy have been achieved to diminish shareholder interference. And to evaluate this, we go beyond the shareholder proposals and beyond the ESG proposal, and we look at all shareholder proposals, also on other topics. And we find very similar results. That is, firms that have more pay metrics, not only ESG metrics, they are sort of equal, is receive fewer shareholder proposals. And I will conclude showing that not only they receive fewer shareholder proposals are interference with a manager's strategy. Some are considered to waste managerial time because of gadflies and so on. But these companies with more pay metrics also experience less dissent against a managerial proposal. So, and this goes again beyond the yes strategy and target of the company. So let me conclude. Is this greenwashing? Well, not sure. Is it a true attempt to improve the yes strategy? Unlikely, because pay doesn't seem very responsive to this target, but is part of the broader communication of the company. The company is saying that yes issues are on the table. And I look forward to Dirk's comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariassunta. So now we have as discussant Dirk Jenter from LSE. Dirk, please.
Could you hear?
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for having me. This is a really interesting paper. So once again, those of you hoping for blood will be disappointed. But there will be at least some little bit of mild pushback on some of the points, I promise. So it's a very ambitious paper. It classifies the CEO pay performance metrics in more than 10,000 listed companies from across the world. So just one very significant contribution is just bringing new data to the table. Because most of the studies we've seen are pretty much S&P 500, sometimes 250. So kind of relatively small samples. I've just looked at a wonderful paper that looks at 73 companies in Europe with very, very detailed analysis. This is 10,000. So it's kind of a completely different ballgame. 3 sets of results. The first one is really about documenting the increasing use and prevalence of these ESG and other metrics over time and documenting that they're highly correlated with each other. So companies tend to use a lot of metrics or relatively few, and how they relate to firm characteristics. Second set of results is about the effect of these ESG metrics on pay levels and pay for performance. And sort of the takeaway there is they don't do very much. So they have very limited impact on payouts and pay for ESG performance, but also pay for any of the other performance metrics. And then sort of the big last part of the paper is sort of why are these metrics used? So what's the point? And there the paper's hypothesis is to build shareholder consensus and strategy and pay. It's a little bit difficult to pin down because it kind of changes in different pages in the paper, but I think that's a relatively good summary of what the paper has in mind. So just to put my cards on the table, I'm very excited about 1 and 2. Relatively few complaints there. Obviously, I want you to do more. I want you to dig deeper. I want you to interpret something a bit different, put a bunch of fixed effects in and on and on and on. Fair enough. But this is super exciting, and I think the paper makes a very, very big contribution, and I learned a lot. I'm, at this point, much less on board with number 3. Not in the sense that I have got strong evidence against this hypothesis, but I'm struggling a little bit with understanding how this works, in sort of what's the model here, in particular in light of this. If these things are just a show, how can they be effective in communicating anything? And the other bit is I don't think that the evidence in the paper right now is actually very supportive. I think there's a bit of a gap between the storytelling on that side of the paper and the actual evidence in the tables. So my plan is to briefly talk about 1 and 2 and then spend most of my remaining time on 3 until you tell me to shut up. So very quickly about 1, just increasing use and prevalence of these things. So a wonderful graph number 1, figure 1 in the paper, the share of firms using various performance metrics. On top, the blue line just tells you any metric type. And you can see that these numbers are very, very high. If anything, knowing these studies on very large companies are expected to be even higher. So I think there's actually a massive size effect in here. I would love you to split that by firm size, because I think we'd really learn something from that, especially since all the prior studies focused on the very, very largest firms. So what are the most popular metrics? Well, you got earnings metrics, EPS, things like that on top, followed by operating metrics, usually sales. Then we got our market metrics right here, the yellow one, so that's usually TSR, maybe stock price performance. You've got ESG on the bottom. And you can see that in the entire sample, ESG has been rising. The US is lagging behind a little bit. This ends in 21. It would be really interesting to expand it now. EU, massive rise there. This actually has a lot to do with sort of gender diversity requirements kicking in here, especially at the board level. So very, very interesting data. So one suggestion here is please split it by firm size, because I know from the US, I know the US data pretty well. I think these numbers should be higher, but then I'm very biased because I've only ever been looking at the S&P 500. So either there's something off about this data compared to what everybody else has been looking at, or the small firms are doing a lot less. One in particular I'm very keen on are these market metrics. Because I know from the S&P 500 data that something like 95% of S&P 500 firms have performance vesting equity. And by far, the number one metric in there is TSR, total shareholder return. Right, so just based on that, I'd expect this number for the S&P 500 to be like 60 to 70%. It's below 40%. So either the small firms are doing a ton less of that, or there's something here that I don't understand. So just sort of in the same vein as somebody who's really interested in this topic, I'd just like to see a lot more detail. Sort of in Adam's paper, we talked about that. Some of these metrics are used in short-term annual incentive plans, which are relatively small. Others are used in long-term incentive plans. Which one is where? So again, the motivation here is these LTI plans and long-term plans tend to be way larger and much, much more important, at least in the US. Maybe it's different in other countries. You could tell us. And the prior studies, including Adam's paper, basically tell us that ESG metrics are almost entirely in these short-term plans, which kind of makes them a bit less exciting. Which of these metrics are used in performance vesting equity, right? Again, the prior literature says it's basically all TSR, a little bit of EPS. Does the ESG stuff start to come into that as well? I would really love to see that. And then sort of a slightly more technical point, I want to see lots more analysis of which firms use this metrics and a very careful distinction how things change over time within firm. So I think right now you're conflating a little bit cross-sectional stuff with time series stuff within the firm. Basically, I want to see firm fixed effects in a lot of these regressions. And some of the stories you're telling right now sort of don't line up, right? So you highlighted the results that if you have a new active block holder, apparently you're upping the ESG metrics. That's not really in the table, right? Because the table is a purely cross-sectional table. All I can see there is that firms that have a new active block holder also have use a lot of ESG metrics. It could totally be the case that the block holders are going into the firm that have the ESG metrics. I need to see that within firm, right? New block holder comes in, metrics change. So you can do a lot more there on that side. Okay, quickly on to the next bit, the level of pay for performance, right? So firms that use more metrics pay their CEOs more. That's an interesting result, but it's mostly driven by operating and market metrics, not really by ESG. So anyone who thought, oh my God, this ESG is just all rent extraction, at least based on this correlation, that doesn't necessarily seem to be there. Let's skip that. Notably, and it's very important, ESG and the other metrics seem to have almost no effect on the sensitivity of pay to either ESG or financial performance. So there doesn't seem to be much of a pay for performance bang for the buck there. Which is really consistent, especially on the ESG side with the prior studies. ESG metrics tend to carry immaterial weights. They're all in the short-term incentive plans, which even in the US is only 17%, tend to have very low weights, often discretionary. What was it? Mindful snacking, right? Whatever the hell that means. So you have that kind of stuff in there. And the targets tend to be relatively easy to achieve, right? And again, Adam's study and Adam and Bob's study sort of confirms that once again. Just a little, and sort of common interpretation, the prior literature says it's all show, it's just greenwashing, this stuff is all nonsense. One little caveat, just again, because I come from sort of the governance side onto that. If you were to look at realized pay rather than granted pay, I'm pretty sure you'd find a pretty large effect of the market-based metrics, again, because of the performance vesting equity, right? It has no effect on the amount you're being given at the very beginning, but then when it comes to the vesting decision, the market metric is going to kick in really, really hard. So there you're actually going to find a big pay for performance effect here for the market-based stuff. All right, let's get to the last bit, where I think we need to do a bit more thinking. So why are these ESG and the other metrics used? So the studies, the paper here says, compensation metrics are used to communicate the corporate strategy to shareholders and build shareholder consensus. All right, so I was kind of it came a bit out of left field in the paper. But I was kind of reading through all the results, kind of like, okay, how did you get there? So I was trying to retrace the argument. I'm not sure I'm doing it justice, so I apologize if I don't. So I think the argument goes something like this. I've just shown you, or reported on the previous slide, that using these metrics doesn't really link pay more closely to ESG or financial performance. Ergo, it's not really about incentives. So you got to look for some other explanation, a non-incentive explanation. Then the second part of the argument is there's evidence in the paper that using more metrics has a causal effect, causes all kind of nice things on the shareholder side. So higher say-on-pay approval, fewer shareholder proposals, which are annoying and pesky, and fewer votes against management proposals. So somehow using more of these things has a causal effect on making the shareholders happier and nicer to the company. So sort of for starters, putting these two things together doesn't necessarily imply that, right? So there's a big logical leap here in there. And I'm struggling with sort of how to put this all together. So let me sort of highlight three things. One is a conceptual point. If we buy into this argument here that these ESG metrics in particular have no incentive effects at all, then it's not at all clear how they can be used to communicate credibly anything about the corporate strategy, right? If this is just cheap talk, if this is just a show, why does it work in somehow credibly communicating the corporate strategy? Now, if these things had genuine bite on the incentive side, then it makes sense. Hey, I'm committing to growth. I'm putting my CEO on a very high-powered incentive contract, rewarding growth, while I can use that to communicate to my shareholders what I'm about to do. But if this is just a show, I'm struggling with that link here. And then another bit that I'm struggling with is that I don't really buy the evidence down here. I don't really think that we've got strong evidence that there's a sort of this causal relationship here, because it's bloody difficult to nail down. Right? You need an instrument. There's an instrument in the paper, and I'll sort of argue in a couple of slides that I don't think that the instrument works in the context of the setup here, sort of in the context of the implicit model. So let me quickly talk about this and that, and then I promise to shut up. So sort of the first point about do incentives that aren't, or do performance metrics that are public, that are announced, but aren't tightly linked to financial payouts, do they have incentive effects? And sort of standard economics said no, right? Standard economics says that performance metric will only alter behavior if they are tied to very substantial financial payouts. Sort of CEOs as sort of these coin-operated automators, right? You put in a bunch of money, points them in a direction and saying, go there, and we're going to pay you more, and they'll do it. That's the model of human behavior. I'm a trained economist. That's kind of, frankly, the model of human behavior that we have in an awful lot of our studies. Obviously, when you talk to board members or comp consultants or psychologists or just human beings, they'll tell you that that's a pretty terrible model of human behavior, right? Humans don't necessarily work like that. So here's a little thought experiment for the academics in the room. Imagine your department head comes to you, makes an announcement at the beginning of the year. From here on, all our faculty are expected to publish 1 paper per year. For you lawyers, nothing. For us finance people, more of a challenge. Have teaching ratings of at least 4.0. Again, for you lawyers, probably no problem at all. Us finance people really struggle with that. And advise at least 2 PhD students. And importantly, everyone's data will be made public. Right? So it will be sent as sort of a name and shame kind of thing. Right? So at the end of the year, we're going to send around a spreadsheet with everybody's performance on these metrics. It's going to change behavior. Right? Notice there's absolutely, I mean, first of all, it's going to piss everybody off, which already kind of tells you that it has a genuine effect. People will care, and it will change behavior. Even so, notice there's no financial incentive tied to that at all. And I think very much the same is true for CEOs. And we have some evidence about that in some of the survey paper we've done. So I'm pretty sure that if a board publicly sets a performance target and says this company now has a target of, or we're setting our CEO a target, oh yeah, I'm going to shut up. We're setting our CEO a target of whatever diversity of our workforce has to go to 40%, 50%, and then the company publicly fails, I think the vast majority of CEOs would care. So last literally 1 minute, I promise. So we need to do a lot more work on that. It is absolutely true sort of about this causal effect business, right? So it's absolutely true that using more metrics is highly correlated with shareholder approval, which is interesting, new, I didn't know it. Might obviously not be causal, right? Could just be an omitted variable. Some type of firms have both lots of metrics and high approval. Other firms look different. Could be all kind of things. And obviously, this is all optimally chosen. We sort of know this is what we teach our PhD students. You wouldn't expect in equilibrium there to be a relationship between these two things. So what's the IV strategy? So we're just going to use ISS peers metrics as an instrument. So if your ISS peers use a lot of metrics, we know from the data you're going to use a lot of metrics as well. Great, so that's the instrument. The result is firms whose ISS peers use more metrics have higher shareholder approval. I mean, that's interesting. It's curious. I'd really like to know why that is. It's difficult to figure out. But just to be clear, right, that's no evidence at all for the paper story, right? And anything, it's inconsistent with the paper story. Because the argument here is that I'm using more metrics because my peers are doing it. I'm blindly copying my peers. And it's otherwise completely orthogonal to my company and everything else. Now, if that's the story, you're clearly not communicating your corporate strategy. Right? Communicating your corporate strategy is about you choosing your metrics to communicate your corporate strategy. You're not blindly choosing it because your peers are choosing it. So there's kind of no connection from here to there. So I don't really think it works here. And what's the explanation? Well, it's probably, again, an omitted firm type. Right? There's some ISFs group similar firms. Some firms have lots of metrics and high approval. Other firms look different. Okay, I'm very much out of time. Let me quickly save that. Okay, super interesting. I've been thinking a lot about it. I read it 3 times. And sort of in the end, I came away with it of thinking we genuinely still don't know why companies use these ESG metrics. I have no evidence against the hypothesis raised. I think communication is a big part of it. I think incentives are a big part of it. And if it's an incentive effect, then you can indeed use it to credibly convey the strategy. Stakeholder pressure, this peer thing is a huge thing. Greenwashing is probably a part of it. So I would just basically approach it with a very, very open mind. Not go to this one hypothesis, but basically go, look, there are lots of things potentially going on. We might be able to sort it out. Apologies for running over.
Thank you so much. Dirk, thanks a lot. Do you want to respond quickly to Dirk while we collect questions from the audience?
So thanks a lot for the comments. So let me start from something stupid, why there is no firm fix effect. Currently, we have 10,000 companies, but this looks more like a cross-section because the sample is expanding. Of course, for some of the reasons that were discussed before, it would be very interesting to know what's happening now that the norms are changing. So we are going to expand the sample, and then the firm fix effect will be possible. But so let me get more to the story. I think that Dirk is assuming a bit too much rationality from the point of view of the shareholders. And in interpreting the evidence, we rely a lot on our previous RFS paper on the corporate guard flies. We know that a lot of shareholder interference and a lot of these shareholder proposals are actually submitted by small individual investors. Why does this matter? These people have no clue what is the sensitivity of this pay to performance. So this loose explanation about the target may be actually something that affect their prior. So the way in which we interpreted the IV, it could be implemented as a discontinuity design. We didn't have time to do that. But is that we decompose the number, the kind of the pay metrics. And what we find is that basically these pay metrics that are more likely to be driven by pressure is what's matter. But I didn't present it because that part needs more work. So.
Okay, thanks so much. We have Ellen.
Thanks. I just wondered about the shareholder resolutions thing, a couple of items. One is they're really clumpy. There are a few very large companies that tend to attract a large proportion of those shareholder resolutions. So I just wondered if you did control for size as one of the things that...
So we control for size, but of course I think it's fair enough that the splits could be done also by size. But these are basically large companies that, for instance, the Norwegian oil fund would invest in. So
yeah, I would doubt that there is any kind of... Yeah, it's mainly size that would drive, like the behavior.
But we have a size there. It's market capitalization, of course. That's all. Of course, in any paper of compensation, you need that.
Yeah, and then I suppose the other thing is the game will be, I mean, shareholder resolutions are just annoying. They're, mainly not implemented. I mean, the vast majority aren't implemented. They're almost all disclosure-based. So if the game is to decrease the probability of the next year getting a bunch of shareholder resolutions, you could imagine that setting ESG targets or any other kind of targets would actually be enough. I mean, it's annoying for the people who file shareholder resolutions too. So if they get thrown a bone, then they're less like. Anyway, there are other plausible explanations for why you would see fewer shareholder resolutions with any setting of targets, just because it's such a big lift to file.
Yeah, but that's precisely what we are saying. That is not only ESG target. These ESG targets appear to have exactly the same effect of other targets.
Thanks, Jill.
So there are a couple of studies that look at companies' ESG statements on analyst calls and in 10Ks and things like that, how often they talk about ESG. And it's been a topic in the US right now because obviously companies are pulling back from that. But I wonder if looking at that data might help you in terms of, are the same companies that are talking about ESG also incorporating ESG into their pay metrics? And, is whether there's a common explanation in terms of, we're committed to stakeholders or greenwashing or we're committing to corporate purpose, kind of be interesting to see, at least to the extent that ESG pay metric is a little bit more of walking the walk as opposed to just talking about it, and might be a little bit harder to reverse than just, okay, we're not going to mention it anymore because it's politically divisive. It might be interesting to see if there's a correlation between the two.
So I completely agree that looking at how much companies talk about ESG is interesting, but in another paper about Euro area banks, we find that banks with browner portfolios talk more about the environment. So it would be a bit hard to say that talking more about the ESG is necessarily evidence that the company has real concern. Yeah, sure.
Right, we have you.
And you have this rich global data on the ESG compensation metrics, but you don't really take full advantage of it, right? I'm just wondering whether you could explore any cross-country variation. You have country fixed effects, but sometimes they could change within the country. For example, there are a lot of sustainability-related regulations going on, right? Gender pay gap, the gender in the board, and sustainability reporting, right? I would argue, for example, in Germany, right, they probably would more likely to have employee-related metrics in their compensation because they have employees in their board. I think cross-sectionally, as well as within a different country across time could vary a lot.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, in the way in which we segmented the various subsample, we were not finding much interesting action. I must also say that it would be hard to do empirics singling out Germany or France, because overall there aren't as many listed companies. But we tried to compare the EU to the US, and overall there are different levels, but the overall patterns were not very different, which is why I don't emphasize it so far.
But the metrics they focus could be very different. For example, US, they focus on DEI, we saw from the first paper, versus in Europe, right? UK, for example, they have a climate disclosure. If they don't disclose, they probably don't even have the measurement.
So there are some graphs on the paper. Actually, DEI is the most frequent metric, both in Europe and in the US. And consider that the environment is not a material for most of companies. Not all companies are in the industry defined brown. So
I just briefly want to react to the comment about mindful snacking. Because I'm like all of us, I've personally mindfully or less snacked in different jurisdictions. There's wisdom in encouraging the manufacturer of cookies to encourage mindful snacking, because if you look, you can do this really easily. You reduce sugar, you reduce certain fats, and there's a obesity epidemic going on. So I think there's something to be said in favor of having a nudge towards modifying recipes. That's just a general comment.
It's not my paper, but what I want to say is that if you use an SIES classification, what there we said that there are some categories that are related to customer and to the product, and mindful snacking would be captured there. And we would classify it as material for industries in the food. So we wouldn't make fun of it. So that's...
Anyone else? All right, so we have 30 minutes for mindful snacking now.